I'm Dr. David Adams. In this session, we're going to look at the significance of an episode that many people are inclined to overlook in the Old Testament, the episode of the golden calf. This is a very important element of the history of the Old Testament that is sometimes misunderstood, but more often simply overlooked. We're going to take a look at this in more detail, and we'll do it in two parts. In the first part, we'll talk about the place of the golden calf episode in the literary context of the book of Exodus, and we'll look at the first part of the narrative, basically chapters 32 to 33. In the second part, we'll focus on the theological significance of the golden calf episode, and we'll take a quick look at chapter 34, which brings the episode to a conclusion. But first, we turn to the place of the golden calf episode in the literary context of the book of Exodus. If we consider the book of Exodus as a whole, it's important to understand that it falls into two main sections, two narrative arcs, we might say. The first of these narrative arcs runs from chapter 3 to chapter 14, broadly speaking, and I like to call this the drama of redemption. This is the account of how God redeemed Israel and brought them out of Egypt. The second narrative arc picks up toward the end of chapter 15 in verse 22 and runs through the end of the book, chapter 40, verse 38. The focus in this narrative arc is on what it means for Israel to be the people of God. And so I like to refer to this as the people of God. These two narrative arcs have in front of them a prologue consisting of Exodus chapters 1 and 2. This prologue introduces the situation of Israel in Egypt, and it also introduces us to the central human character in the narrative, that of Moses. And finally, to bridge the gap between these two narrative arcs, we have the song that Moses sings by the sea. The song by the sea, particularly the first part, which connects back to the drama of redemption. The second part of the song looks forward and anticipates the account of Israel as the people of God. So in a very real sense, this song by the sea serves as a bridge to connect these two narrative arcs together. Let's turn now our focus to the second of these narrative arcs, the story of Israel as the people of God. This narrative arc begins with the second half of the song by the sea, which focuses on what's going to happen to Israel moving forward. The theme of this whole section of the book is introduced in the outset. You lead by your chesed the people whom you have redeemed. And I've intentionally left the Hebrew word chesed untranslated here because we'll talk later about the significance of this term and what it means for Israel's life in the presence of God. Now, as this narrative arc unfolds, it begins, as we said, with laying down the theme and the trajectory in the second half of the song by the sea. Then Israel leaves the seashore and sets out on a journey to Sinai. Once they get to Mount Sinai, in chapter 19, they then receive the Torah in chapters 20, 21, 22, and 23, and then establish a covenant with God in chapter 24. The following chapters, 25 to 31, provide the provisions that God makes for Israel's worship. This is followed in chapters 32 to 34 by the golden calf crisis that we're going to look in more detail at. And when that's done, then Israel is able to enact the provisions for worship that God prescribed in chapters 35 to 40 with the building of the tabernacle and its dedication. Now, there's a theme that runs through the first part of this, through the journey to Sinai and the receiving of the Torah up to the establishing of the covenant. And that's the theme of God putting Israel to the test. God sets up several tests along the way to see if Israel will be faithful to God's word or whether they will not be faithful to God's word. And we can see this theme unfold just by looking at some key verses along the way. So in chapter 15, near the beginning of this, God says, if you will diligently listen, or perhaps carefully listen, or even fully listen, to the voice of the Lord your God, and do what is right in his eyes, and give ear to his commandments, and keep all his statutes, I will put none of the diseases upon you I put on the Egyptians. So here at the outset, God says, the standard is that you should keep all that I command. In the next chapter, verse 16, God tells Moses that he is putting Israel to the test to see whether they will keep his teaching or not. Later in the chapter, when they fail to do what God has instructed them, then God says to Moses, speaking to Moses as the representative for all of Israel, how long will you refuse to keep my commandments and my Torah? The next time we encounter this idea is in chapter 19. There God says to Israel, if you will indeed obey, or again carefully obey, or fully obey my voice and keep my covenant, you will be my treasured possession among all the people. So Israel understands what God is asking them to do, and so a few verses later, the people respond and say, all that the Lord has spoken, we will do. So they say this before they even hear what God is asking of them. And this is followed in the narrative by the giving of the Ten Commandments in chapter 20. At the end of the Ten Commandments, the people are amazed, terrified at this incredible theophany of God on the mountaintop. But Moses says to them, don't be afraid. God has come to test you, so that the fear of him may be upon you and you may not sin. So again, this theme of testing is a very important one throughout these chapters. In chapter 23, as we come to the end of the Torah, God says of the messenger that he's going to send to lead them to the land of promise, he says, pay careful attention to him and obey his voice. Again, this injunction to be faithful in following God's teaching. And in verse 22, if you carefully obey his voice and do all that I say, I'll be an enemy to your enemy and adversary to your adversaries. The Israelites, again, fully comprehend what God is asking of them. So in chapter 24, Moses tells all the people what God has commanded of them, and the people respond in unison by saying, all the words that the Lord has spoken, we will do. And a few verses later, in verse 7, they repeat this same idea when they say, all that the Lord has spoken, we will do, and we will be obedient. Moses then reminds them one last time by taking the blood and throwing it on the people, and he says, behold the blood of the covenant. And speaking of the covenant, he characterizes that covenant as the covenant that God has made with you in accordance with all these words. In other words, what Moses is saying here is that the covenant comprises everything that God has said to them, all the words that he has spoken to them. And Israel is asked to keep all those words and to keep them perfectly. So the theme is that Israel is required to keep the Torah perfectly if they're going to be the people of God. And Israel understands that and promises that it will. Now here's the catch, and it's a very important one for the way the narrative unfolds. If we look at the covenant that Israel makes with God on the basis of all these words, as Moses says, there is no provision for failure anywhere in that covenant. There's no idea of what will happen if Israel fails to be faithful in keeping everything that God has commanded. Now, this leaves a tremendous unanswered question in the narrative. That unanswered question is, what will happen if Israel fails to keep the Torah of God perfectly? Because there's no provision for failure. This question of what will happen if they fail to keep the Torah perfectly hangs over the narrative like a sword of Damocles waiting to strike if Israel fails the test that God has set for it. So this sets up our understanding of the literary function of the golden calf episode. From a literary perspective, the golden calf incident precipitates and then resolves the main crisis of the second half of the book of Exodus, the second narrative arc. So if we think of this narrative arc that we've been talking about, and we think just about the narrative events, begins with the journey to Sinai, the receiving of the Torah, and all the testing that goes on in chapters 15, 16, and 17 of the book of Exodus here, God putting Israel to the test. And then in chapter 24, he establishes a covenant with them on the basis of all these words. And now we get this excursus on the provisions of worship. And this is really an excursus. It's not the narrative is on pause at this point, while all this information is given to Moses on Mount Sinai. And the next event that happens in the narrative is the golden calf episode. So the golden calf episode is in the narrative to answer this question: what will happen if Israel fails to keep the Torah of God perfectly? That's why we say that this incident precipitates and then resolves the central crisis of the second half of the book. And if we can look ahead to what we're going to talk about in the second part of this presentation, we might add the theological function of the golden calf episode is to answer this unanswered question by teaching Israel, and then through Israel, by extension, teaching us what is the basis of Israel's ongoing relationship with God and what is the basis of our relationship with God similarly. So let's turn now to the first part of the golden calf episode itself. There are really two major blocks here. Chapters 32 and 33 are the account of the breaking of the covenant, and then chapter 34 is God's renewal of the covenant. So we'll walk very quickly through Israel's breaking of the covenant, and I'm assuming that you're familiar with this narrative. If you're not, you might want to pause and take the time to read chapters 32 and 33 of the book of Exodus. The narrative kind of breaks down into these sections. There's the actual apostasy, God's first response, and then Moses confronts the situation, and then God's second response, and then Moses makes a request of God. So just to walk through these and highlight some of the issues. We read, starting at the beginning of chapter 32, when the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountain, they said to Aaron, "Make gods for us who will lead us up from here, because Moses, who brought us out of Egypt, we don't know what's become of him." So it's the doubt and uncertainty about the situation that the text tells us is the motivation for Israel in this case. Aaron responds by telling them to take off the jewelry and the jewelry of their wives and daughters and to bring it to him. So the people do that, and Moses received gold and fashioned it into a golden calf. And now we come to a very interesting point. In chapter 32, verse 4, we read, they said, These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. And this raises a couple of questions. Note that this is plural. These are your gods, plural. That's how the ESV translates it. It's the ESV we're looking at here. The Hebrew text is Ele Elohecha. Now, the reason that this is significant is that normally in Hebrew, you may or may not know, the word for God, Elohim, is always or almost always in the plural. And it's translated as a plural, gods with a small g, if you will. When it refers to the gods of other nations, we usually translate it as a singular, a capital G, God, when we're talking about Israel's God. In Hebrew, when they're talking about other gods, they normally use a modifying word, an adjective or pronoun that's plural. And when they're talking about Israel's God, they use a modifying word, an adjective or a pronoun that's singular. Well, in this case, Ele, the word on the right in Hebrew that you see, is plural. And that's why the ESV translates this as, these are your gods, O Israel. But notice what it says. These are your gods who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. Which God brought Israel up from the land of Egypt? It wasn't the gods of the Egyptians. It wasn't the gods of the Canaanites. It was Yahweh, the God of Israel. And that's why we have a split in the way this is translated in some translations. Now, I've got on the screen here a whole bunch of translations, and you probably can't read them because the type is too small, but that's all right. I'll color code what you want to see. And the first thing I want to show you is that the verses I have highlighted in gold here translate this as a singular. This is your God, Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt, not as a plural. In other words, these translations all understand the golden calf that Aaron has made, and Aaron's claim that this is a golden calf that doesn't represent the gods of Egypt or the gods of Canaan. It represents Israel's own God. Interestingly here, in this respect, the American Standard Version, the old version of 1901, translated as a plural. The New American Standard, the 95 version, translates it as a singular, so they made a change. Similarly, the old version of the King James translates it as a plural. The New King James translates it as a singular. And of the NIV translations, the NIV 84 and the newer NIV, both translated as plural. But the New International Reader's Version, aimed at younger readers, reads it as a singular. So the point is there's disagreement about whether this phrase, Ele Elohecha, refers to Israel's God or whether it refers to the gods of Egypt or the gods of Canaan, some other gods besides Israel's. Well, let's look at what else we can see about this question. As we said, here in Exodus 32, it's modified by a plural word, and so it's translated by the ESV as a plural. The only other time that this incident is described specifically in the Old Testament comes in the book of Nehemiah in chapter 9, verse 18. There we read, even when they had made for themselves a golden calf and said, this is your God, singular, who brought you up out of Egypt. And in this case, if we look at the Hebrew, we have a singular modifier, ze, not the plural modifier, ele, that we had in chapter 32. So there's no doubt in the case of in the case of Nehemiah, there's no doubt whatsoever that it should be read as a singular. And also, the only other occurrence of the idea of a plural reference to deity being associated with bringing Israel up out of Egypt is the claim that Jeroboam makes when setting up the golden calves in the temples that he makes at Bethel and Dan. He says, of these golden calves, that they are the gods who brought Israel up from the land of Egypt. Now, in this case, the plural makes sense because there are two calves. There's a golden calf in Bethel and a golden calf in Dan. So it makes sense that we would refer to them in the plural as that context. But here in the book of Exodus, it's a little more problematic. And that problem is compounded by what Aaron says in the next verse. In verse 5, we read, "When Aaron saw this, he built an altar before it. Aaron made a proclamation and said, 'Tomorrow will be a feast to the Lord.'" So Aaron is claiming that this golden calf that he has made is going to be part of this festival celebration to Yahweh. So at least in Aaron's mind, the golden calf is not for the worship of other gods. The golden calf is for the worship of Israel's own God. So that's the core incident. Now let's look at how God responds to that, beginning in verse 7. We'll skip down to verse 10, actually. God says, "Let me alone, that my wrath may burn hot against them, and I may consume them, that I may make a great nation of you." So here God is speaking to Moses, that he wants to wipe Israel out and start over again with Moses and with the descendants of Moses. Moses then responds to try to persuade God not to do that, not to destroy Israel. And he does this on the basis of two things. First, he says that God, you went to a lot of trouble to get Israel out of Egypt, and now you're going to destroy them. Why would the Egyptians think of you? What would this teach Egypt about you? Why would the Egyptians say, with evil intent you brought them out to kill them? So Moses first appeals to God's own reputation and the way people in Egypt, the rest of the world, would understand Yahweh to be. And the second appeal that Moses makes in verse 13 is based on God's promise. Moses says, "Remember Abraham, Isaac, and Israel," that is Jacob, "your servants to whom you swore by your own self, saying that he would multiply their offspring," and so forth. And in verse 14 we read that God heeded the arguments that Moses makes and changed his mind about the harm or disaster that he had spoken about bringing upon the people. Now I want to say something about this verse because sometimes people misunderstand this. We hear the ESV says the Lord relented. Other translations will say God repented or regretted or changed his mind about this. And this raises a question in the minds of some people because they read a text like 1 Samuel 15:29, which says, "The glory of Israel," that is God, "will not lie or have regret, for he is not a man that he would have regret." How do you reconcile the idea that Israel's God will not have regret, and as Numbers 23:19 says, he's not a man that he would lie, or a son of man that he would change his mind? So how do we reconcile the fact that God clearly changes his mind in Genesis 32 as a result of Moses' entreaty, and other places in the Bible suggest that God doesn't do that? Well, the answer to that is right in front of you on the screen at chapter 23, verse 19. The point here is that God is faithful and trustworthy. It's not that God doesn't, the point is not that God doesn't respond to prayer. The point is that when God makes a promise, he will keep it. And so we read, "Has he said and will not do it? Has he spoken and will he not fulfill it?" Unlike people who make promises and don't follow through, the God of Israel is one who makes promises and keeps those promises. So that's the context of this idea that God doesn't change his mind. That is to say, God doesn't fail to keep the promises that he makes to his people. So it's an important distinction, and we should not read verse 14, that God changed his mind, in such a way that it should be a concern for us. God is not changing his mind about the promises that he makes to Israel. In fact, after the entreaty of Moses, God is keeping the promises that he made to Israel. So that's God's first response. Then Moses comes down and confronts the situation. As Moses comes down, he sees and hears the festival, and he gets angry, and he breaks the tablets that contain the commandments. And then he takes the calf, and the text tells us that he burned it with fire and ground it to powder. Now here, there's a little incidental observation we might make about the golden calf, namely that it was not solid gold. It was, in fact, wood with gold leaf. And the way we know that is the text tells us that he burned it with fire and ground it to powder. He wouldn't be able to grind it to powder if it were solid gold. It would melt and be liquid, not powder. We might also have concluded that because the things that God makes in the tabernacle, or instructs Israel to make in the tabernacle later, the Ark of the Covenant and the incense altar and the bread of the presence, the table that holds the bread of the presence, that is. These are all made of acacia wood that have gold leaf. And so while the text doesn't specifically tell us that's the case here, it almost certainly is. And so that explains how they could burn it with fire and grind it to powder. Now, Moses continues, and he challenges Aaron and says, "What did you do that you brought such great sin upon the people?" And Aaron responds by saying, it's not my fault. You know how these people are, how they're set on evil. They said to me, "Make gods who will go before us." And so I said to them, let anyone who has on gold take it off. And so Aaron says, they gave it to me, and I threw it in the fire, and out came this calf. Well, two things here. First, we already know, because we read a few moments ago, the fact that Aaron himself made the calf. He didn't just throw the jewelry in the fire and this calf popped out. And secondly, this is about the funniest thing in the Old Testament, this idea that, I just threw the gold into the fire and poof, this calf comes out. Like something your kids would say when they don't want to admit that they've done something wrong. Moses doesn't buy the excuse that Aaron makes. And Moses then says on the next day to the people, he tells them that they've sinned, and he says, I will go up to the Lord. Perhaps I can make atonement for your sin. Now, this is the first time in the Bible that we get a reference to the notion of an atoning sacrifice. Now, I'm not saying that they never did atoning sacrifices before. I'm saying that this is the first time that it's specifically mentioned in the Old Testament. So it's significant that this idea of atonement is connected with the sin that the people makes. And so Moses goes to God, and he admits the sin of the people, and he says to them, if you will not forgive them, then blot me out of your book instead of blotting them out of the book. Here again, we have Moses acting as a type of Jesus who is to come, who will offer himself for the sins of the people. So again, an important moment in the history of the theology of the Bible. God responds, and he says, no. He says, whoever sinned, I'll blot out of my book. But now you go and lead the people as I said. So that's the way Moses attempted to resolve the situation. And now we come to God's second response. God says to Moses, go up, take the people and lead them to the land of Egypt that I swore to give to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I will give it to them, and I will send an angel before you and drive out the inhabitants. But, as God says, I will not go among you myself. So God says to Moses, okay, I promised to give the Israelites the land, and so I will. But God is basically going to annul the marriage between himself and Israel that was enacted in the covenant of chapter 24. And God actually says this for Israel's own good. He says, "Lest I consume you on the way, for you are a stiff-necked people." So God's response we could summarize by saying, look, we made a covenant based on the idea that you were going to keep my teaching perfectly. But you cannot keep my teaching perfectly. Therefore, the covenant is invalid. You cannot be my people. I cannot be your God, because if I allow this unclean people into my presence, then I will destroy them. And of course, the people hear this as a disastrous word. They go into mourning as if for the dead. But again, God says to Moses, sort of explain to them that if for a single moment I would go among you, then I would consume you. Again, the holy and righteous God cannot tolerate the sinfulness of the people in his presence. And so the righteousness of God would demand the punishment of disobedience. And so then Moses says, look, you say to me, bring up this people, but you haven't said who you will send with me. And you say, you know me by name, and I found favor in your sight. So Moses is now appealing to God on the basis of their personal relationship. And so Moses says, if I found favor in your sight, then show me your ways that I may know how to, we should understand this last phrase, that I may know how to continue to find favor in your sight. And remember that this nation is your people. And Moses is reminding God that all the way back in Exodus chapter 3, God called Israel his people. So it's God who chose them, God who made them his people. And Moses reminds God of that. And again, God responds in a positive way to Moses' appeal. So in verse 14, God says, in effect, okay, my presence will go with you, and I will give you rest. And then Moses kind of can't take yes for an answer here, because he comes back with another argument. He said, well, how will it be known that I found favor in your sight if you don't go with us? How will it be that we are different from all the other people on the face of the earth? A very important concept, by the way. Israel's distinctiveness is rooted in God's presence with them. So that's the second response. And God again agrees not to destroy Israel, but in this case, agreeing that he will go up among them. And so Moses makes a further request of God. Moses says to God, show me your glory. And here Moses is asking to see the full revelation of who God is. God responds by saying, I will make my goodness, that is, what is good about me, pass before you, and I will proclaim before you my name, Yahweh, the Lord. This idiom, I will proclaim before you my name, the Lord, is really an idiom of definition in Hebrew. So what God is saying here in verse 19 is that he's going to define for Moses the meaning of the name Yahweh. And then he goes on to expound something connected to that meaning. He says, I will be gracious on whom I will be gracious, and I will show mercy on whom I will show mercy. So God is saying, in effect, okay, I'm going to reveal something to you of my character, and I will define the meaning of the name Yahweh for you. But that's not going to give you the power to control me in any way. Here God is thinking about the way they operated in the ancient world, where to know the name of God, it would be to give the worshiper the power to manipulate the deity through magic in the cultus. And God is saying to Israel through Moses, he's saying, that's not going to work for me. I will tell you the meaning of the name Yahweh, but I will be gracious to whom I'll be gracious, and show mercy to whom I'll show mercy. You're not going to be able to manipulate me or control me in any way. And then God goes on to say, this verse that everyone knows well, you cannot see my face, for man shall not see me and live. And so he says to Moses, go stand behind the rock, and when I pass by, you can see my back. So God is saying, I'll give you a great revelation, but it's not going to be the full revelation of my person that you would most like to have. And so that wraps up our look at the golden calf episode in the literary context of the book of Exodus, and also our quick survey of the actual first part of the narrative. And we'll continue in the next part with the ending of the narrative and some reflection on the theological significance of this account for the Bible, as well as for the Old Testament in particular. I'm Dr. David Adams, and thank you for joining us for this quick examination of the Golden Calf.